Yes, I don't know. It's probably good to get them in. I have a feeling we're going to be pretty flexible. If I had to take a guess, until we get things really up and running, that we're offering up courses.
The thing is, the course load, like I was looking at it, I'm like, I feel like it's take 18 credit hours.
I'm just
email
to those questions.
Yeah.
No, you'll be fine.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably involved in the early stages. Planning like that. So,
I'll do that.
I'm probably gonna work this summer on the joint law for my OCP. You get me to know about that class.
Like a JD.
MPP. No. Yeah. The world.
So you just go in, you have to get into law school first, or you have to
You have to get in, you have to get in both programs independently. Usually what you do is you spend your first year in a law school, or like your first 2 years just in law school, and then you do a year of mostly policy. That's the way most of this program is set up. But we haven't figured out the hours. That's my job. Figure it out.
I think you'll still work in GRE
For a while.
okay. GRE plus LSAT.
Okay, I have a feeling that that's where if somebody takes the LSAT, that's GRE. I don't think I actually. I don't know, because there's no math.
Yeah.
Well, there is math in GRE, but it's. I got some.
What is it LSAT more about, like watching rap film and some based games?
Yeah, there's a little bit of probability. You got some other stuff. Just loose little. All right. Happy last day of class for this class, please. Are we feeling exciting? I might cry.
That's favorite.
We are his favorite.
It started off strong for Greece, was first one here.
I was. How early were you?
And look at the light board. I had nothing to do with it.
It's a great show.
Oh, miracle.
It's a great
They
show.
were working last class.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
How did you say that?
Still hate.
I'm just.
When do you allow me to play?
Even though he stopped playing before you were born.
Yeah, don't care. Hey.
Right.
Who? Christian Lane.
It's a wonderful 30 for 30. Have you watched it? Yeah.
It's a good one.
Yeah. For anybody who really wants to know the story behind my shirt. It's watch the ESPN 30 for 30. It's called I Still Hate Christian Laettner. I actually remember watching that Kentucky game. Remember exactly where I was.
No, you know what game is ingrained in my brain in that way? Freaking Villanova.
Yeah.
I was on the floor of my room
Wait, before or after the shot?
when Marcus Page's shot went in, I ran into my mom's room and I was like screaming at the top of my lungs. And then I went back into my room and then just radio silence.
Oh, God.
And then 15 minutes later, it was my birthday. And I was
I'm sorry.
That's how it's over. So then they won the next year on your
Yeah.
birthday.
That is true.
I
Did they actually win
Yeah.
your birthday?
Yeah.
It would have been interesting if we had actually won this year.
Also would have been on my birthday. That's
Yeah.
2 losses.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm 1 for 2.
It's historically, UNC has won like the spring before I enrolled at Carolina. So we won in '93. I started undergrad the fall of '94. Fall of '93. And then we won in 2005. I started my PhD in the fall of 2005.
You gotta go to more school.
You gotta try. Isn't another PhD only like 2 more years?
To like tack it on?
No, you have to do it, you have to do the whole
You gotta
thing.
do the whole thing again? That's stupid.
Allison.
They should give you like a discount.
They don't even give my daughter a discount.
What?
No legacy.
That's messed up.
So,
Yeah, you go.
not even for me working, it's just me. There is a scholarship, but I know, I just saw that email too. I have to figure out if we qualify. Anyway, okay. Class, good focus today. So a couple things real fast. I did post some additional cost benefit questions just this morning that are up there with answers that y'all can use for practice. You can use them as models when you're creating your own. Remember that you can do that for extra credit, and I'm going to take one of y'all to put on the exam. I also post the study guide for the exam. So it's up there. We're gonna do like a little review session, right? What did we decide, like the day before? Or we haven't really decided. When's the reading day? Sunday?
Yeah, their exams on Saturday.
I know that there are exams on Saturday,
Their reading is.
but there's no exams on Sunday. Do you want to do it on Sunday? The exam's on Tuesday. Will you have actually looked at anything on Sunday?
Yeah.
I mean, I know that
I'm recovering.
I'm strictly econ until.
Yeah, that's awesome. Are you ready?
Yeah, strictly.
I'll send out,
Friday.
I'll send out an email, figure out if we
Friday.
can do that. How many of you have exams on Monday?
I think I looked at it.
Yeah.
What is the?
Yeah, we're gonna exam on Friday.
The second, yeah.
Okay. All right, well, we'll figure something out. Any questions about course stuff? For being here for the final exam, yeah.
So like the other grades for like the other problems.
We'll all be done by the time you take your final exam.
Okay. Okay. What if I don't like the grades and I get on them and it's too late?
Well, you can still apply.
But it doesn't.
The question is, what effect that complaining is.
I don't
having.
know.
It depends if I screwed up or not. It does happen. Shocking.
No.
But what I thought we could do is I want to go over a little bit of policy diffusion. Just, I think it's interesting. And the class is called Policy Analysis and Innovation. I don't know why I didn't come up with that name. But do this, probably take 30, 45 minutes maybe, and then we can talk about exam and other random things like Samantha. That should not have reminded you of.
It's whooping your ass. It's whooping your ass.
It's been killing me the last few days.
Yeah, no,
It's took me 251 words.
Jesus
Oh my
Christ.
God.
Jeez.
Jeez.
See,
I
I
got
put my
pulled
mom
up
on
like
it
7.
and she got yesterday's in 33 and she hasn't let me hear the end of it.
Took me 115 yesterday.
I didn't even finish.
Anyway,
Just clip.
today was a little bit better.
I got that one, like,
So
it was more of a-
this will be, kind of not kind of, this is the last substantive thing, and you are expected to know this for the final exam. So basically what we're talking about with policy diffusion is just how policies spread. So think about, viruses and other such things, but how they get from one place to another. Okay. Some people actually have a much more specific definition of it, where there's, read it right there. And I guess maybe you can tell me, what's the difference between these two things? What's the main difference between these two ideas as to what policy diffusion is?
Bruce?
The way I kind of interpreted it was, the first one is how one policy affects the other one, and the other one is like how you're influenced by other governments too. So like one is giving, one's receiving, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's.
In a way, yeah. I mean, I think the key word is influence.
Exactly.
That in some sense, governments are actively trying to influence other governments, right? Or, branches of governments or, county governments, that kind of thing. One is more just kind of like generic, like it just kind of happens, right? Like a virus. The other one is like you're intentionally infecting somebody to a certain degree. I don't know why, this is very typical of academics, right? That they have debates about this kind of thing. From my perspective, it's a little bit of both. Sometimes they just kind of spread naturally as people see what works, what doesn't work. There are certainly times where, say, the federal government really wants state governments to do particular things. If you go back to the drinking age, right? It used to be that in several states, at least you could buy beer when you were 18. Some states had drinking ages of 18 and that kind of thing. And the federal government can't force states to adopt a particular drinking age. But what they did was they threatened to withhold highway funding. And when they did that, then all the states switched to 21. And so there are definitely examples of one government influencing other governments out there. So just want to go through some of the basic theories, all of which have some relevance, I think, right? There isn't like a correct theory of policy diffusion. The first one, geographic clustering, again, this is just states, for example, in the same part of the country tend to have similar policies. A lot of this falls along cultural lines, demographic lines, that kind of thing. This was certainly true, much more true historically, when we didn't have the ability necessarily to communicate instantaneously. I didn't want to do that. I snapped and I hit the button. But our ability to learn from governments and entities much further away has increased, exponentially. And so the sort of limitation of being close to somebody no longer really applies, but it's still, in terms of culture and that kind of thing. And you can just think about the South. COVID is one example. You can look at geographic clustering today in terms of all the new anti-abortion laws, tends to be in the South and lower Midwest, which often have sort of a similar policy portfolio. But it's just kind of learning from your neighbor, right, is the idea. So you do see it. Another thing you see is competition, where different levels of government are competing for certain people, certain jobs, certain resources. You see this all the time in economic development policy when they're trying to lure Amazon to build a warehouse somewhere nearby. Obviously the RTP area scored pretty big when we're getting a new Apple facility in the research park. Here's the thing about competition, though. It's kind of stupid. Because how do you win these competitions? Well, generally speaking, you're giving more tax incentives or just giving shit away to companies so that they come there. And the vast majority of time, it doesn't work out. I can't remember how many years ago now it was. It's been within the last 10 years, but Dell opened up a new computer facility in Greensboro. And they had all these promises of how many jobs they'd create, and, you know, all this kind of stuff. They got lots of tax incentives. And it closed down within like 2 years. So, you know, the idea of competition as a theory really started with Thibault or Thibault, or however you want to pronounce the crazy Frenchman's name. How many of y'all have heard of this voting with your feet? Yeah, this idea that people will move somewhere according to some kind of preferred policy portfolio really got started with welfare programs. This notion that people would move to states that had more generous welfare programs, which all the research shows people don't do. But nonetheless was quite popular. You know, I talked about tax credits. You can also think about the lottery. This is definitely something that competition plays a role in. North Carolina didn't have a lottery for a really, really long time, but Virginia did and South Carolina did. And at some point, you have to sort of be like, well, we're losing revenues, right, to these surrounding states. Some states hold firm. Alabama still doesn't have a lottery. I don't know about other states. I just used to live in Alabama. But this notion that we compete with each other can be important. There are some pretty crucial limitations in the Constitution itself in terms of the interstate commerce clause that do put limitations on what governments can do if it's having a significant impact on interstate commerce. But by and large, that doctrine is conveniently ignored when it comes to things like tax credits. Related to this notion of sort of voting with your feet and that kind of stuff is this idea of a race to the bottom. Anybody remember Obama's policy, race to the top? Probably not. It was Obama's sort of signature education policy, trying to get schools to essentially compete with each other, to perform better, and when they do, they got additional funding and that kind of thing. In policy, we're often concerned with this race to the bottom, and I say it's related to the competition because if you think about state welfare policies, this is where this got its start. Was, you know, states are trying to avoid being what's known as a welfare magnet. And so what they do is they enact rather harsh restrictions on who's eligible for those aspects of the welfare state that state governments are responsible for, like Medicaid. You also saw this to a certain extent, you haven't seen it recently, but Alabama, Arizona, Georgia, a little bit, a bunch of states try to enact laws to discourage the presence of undocumented immigrants. That's kind of a race to the bottom scenario, these self-deportation laws.
So SB 1070.
Yeah, yeah. That's in Arizona. Which, you know, the vast majority of which got struck down. If you're curious, the one thing that the Supreme Court did not strike down about the Arizona law actually had to do with racial profiling. They let that one stand. Yeah. The reasoning was, we don't know that it's going to happen yet. You're like, but it specifically says that they can pull people over because they look like they're undocumented. And just because it hasn't happened yet. Anyhow, one of the more interesting decisions of the Supreme Court, I'll just say. So a lot of this had to do with the federal government trying to give up responsibility over welfare policies. Like it didn't start out that states were responsible for Medicaid eligibility and lots of the other administration of welfare programs. But part of the devolution, I guess, trend that really started a little bit in the 70s, but really took off in the 80s of trying to reduce the federal government's role in people's lives, resulted in these race to the bottom policies. In terms of how accurate this is as a theory, it's very mixed with the evidence. There are certain Supreme Court decisions that put some limitations on it. But mostly you can explain a lot of the similarities or variations between the states that might be attributable to this race to the bottom idea through geographic clustering and through other things. But it is one of the big sort of areas of policy diffusion, so I thought I ought to talk about it. Yeah.
So what do they mean by race to the bottom? Like, why is it called that?
Well, it got its name of this race to the bottom because you're having all these bottom, this is terrible, but like bottom feeders coming in, people on welfare. Yeah.
Shade.
I also, think if you think about the competition theory, like the tax credits, that to me is a race to the bottom, even though you're going up. But I mean, it's this notion that you're just going to compete and outduel each other with these tax credits. No one wins in that scenario because you're going to end up having to give so many tax credits to these companies that you're going to lose money. But they still do it. I did a research project, and I was a grad student for a professor for this Brazilian gun company. This is one of the fun things about like being a researcher and having clients and that kind of thing, right? To learn about random stuff. But they wanted to open up a manufacturing plant in the U.S. and they wanted to know where to do it. And so they hired this professor who's no longer here. He hired me. And it was all about seeing, okay, where can we get these tax credits? Where can we get, almost land given away, all kinds of stuff like that. Ended up being recommended somewhere in Georgia, and then they ended up not doing anything. All right, this one's actually important. I think this notion of states or even cities as laboratories of policy, where you get these test cases. Okay, the notion of states as, how many have you all heard that term, laboratory of democracy? You know where it comes from? Oh, I put it up there. Damn it. It actually comes from a Supreme Court decision, actually a dissent, where Justice Brandeis talked about it in 1932. But this is kind of one of the unique aspects of federalism that comes into play, that we have all these different governments, right? And a lot of them have overlapping jurisdiction, right, or concurrent powers. And so they can try things out and we can see if it works, if it doesn't work. And what really matters here is solid evaluation, right? Just to test whether or not this is a good idea or a bad idea. So it really brings in a role for policy analysts. In this situation, under this theory, the idea of geographic clustering competition become much less important because it's supposedly all about evidence. Of course, one of the problems is that we have a geographic clustering problem with evidence itself. You understand what I mean? There are certain areas of the United States that seem to have an issue with science, in fact, and that kind of thing. Come on, don't give me that face.
Name one.
I can't just name it.
Why not? No, why not?
So one of the things that happens with learning that can be potentially problematic is that we might know that a policy is effective, But politics might get in the way, and especially sort of regional politics and that kind of thing. You look at conditional cash transfers, which I know I've talked about before, which are effective programs. But from a political point of view, they're almost non-starters in most places in the United States. One of the sort of best examples of learning from a policy perspective was this S-chip program. Do y'all know what that is? It's the state child health insurance program, something like that.
I think somebody did like a presentation.
Or a one-on-one class, maybe,
On S-chip.
Yeah.
It's kind of like an expansion of Medicaid, but only for kids. And what happened was, one or a couple states started doing it. Other states started seeing how effective it was. And now I think every state has some form of S-chip program. But it seems like it checks all the boxes in terms of fitting this learning theory of diffusion. You can also look at some of the current experiments going on with soda taxes, with universal basic income. You're starting to see some ideas of cash transfers being used. They tend not to be the conditional kind. They're unconditional cash transfers, essentially welfare. But anyhow, any questions or comments on any of this? Thanks. It's a sneeze fest. We can have class outside.
I didn't know there was an option.
It's not, I would be sweating buckets. I start sweating as soon as it hits 70 degrees.
It's the only time it happened.
Oh my gosh. All right. This next one is basically getting at this idea right here, like not all imitation is good. Like we don't necessarily want states copying each other, especially when it's bad policy. And whenever there is some element of coercion, right? We generally don't like that. And it's important to understand the difference here. Imitation really is just copying. Okay. So I have examples up here: overbuilding infrastructure. Now I don't mean like bridges and that kind of thing. I'm really talking more about like stadiums. Right, we have all these like places competing for sports teams. So they'll build a brand new stadium and hope that they come there. Then half the time they build this brand new stadium and they don't come there.
Like the athletics.
Like the athletics. And you just wasted a whole bunch of money. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. That's probably why Charlotte got a Major League Soccer team as opposed to the Raleigh area, even though we were a much better market from a soccer perspective. Anyway. Coercion is when there are actual threats. You saw this in North Carolina with HB4, the bathroom bill, HB2, the bathroom bill, right? Where after that came out, then you had the state government basically saying, you can't do this. And they try to enact state laws to override it. You've also seen it with smoking. So maybe, that's something maybe that more people actually agree with. But it really started out that just a few localities started doing these no smoking ordinances in restaurants. And then they gradually started expanding. Have you heard of the term unfunded mandate before? It's a very, very common argument against any policy that people disagree with. So No Child Left Behind was often labeled an unfunded mandate if states were required to do all this testing and this kind of thing, but the federal government didn't actually give them money to do so. That's why they call it an unfunded mandate. There's also a certain amount of coercion that's inherent in federalism. So I talked about the drinking age. You saw this actually get struck down with the expansion of Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, where the Supreme Court actually said you're going too far in terms of your coercion by threatening to withhold all of the Medicaid money if you don't expand. That's too much. Right, so there are some constitutional limitations on what the federal government can do in terms of coercion, but they are pretty high. Couple other things that come into this next one. The first one is known as bottom-up policy making. Now, this doesn't have to do with like interest groups, the way you think of bottom-up politics and that kind of thing. But what may happen is a bunch of cities, counties, even states enact policy that then leads to the higher level in the federal system being like, well, we might as well. You know? So there's a lot of people that make this argument with same-sex marriage. Once you had a certain number of states who had, approved same-sex marriage, and the Supreme Court was like, well, just should do it, nationwide. Yeah, it's called the snowball effect. There's also this pressure valve effect, which is kind of the reverse, where a bunch of localities do something, and then the state says, oh, well, we don't have to, because all these other places are doing it. And we're gonna let them do what they know, and they know their sort of environment best. So we're not gonna do it. So snowball effect and then pressure valve effect, releasing the pressure. We also have to think about like capacity and resources, and some states, some city governments just simply don't have the same level of resources as others to do things. So they might fail to do so, not because they don't want to, but because they just don't have the capability. So you'll see them following state policy and that. I know I'm just droning on here, but I'm gonna finish this really fast now. You're gonna be happy that I droned on. Yeah, so a couple other things to think about. This notion of early adopters, right? Like the technology, we think about individuals being early adopters. Are any of y'all early adopters? Yeah, I'm not. Gotta wait and see a little bit. Although, did I tell you that my son won an Apple Watch at Frankie's Fun Park?
No way.
Yeah.
How many tickets did you get? How? What game?
You know that game where there's like a key that you have to like
Oh,
position, and get through.
How many tries did it take?
It only took him like 3.
Yeah.
You're lying.
This is the watch right here.
Why did you get
I
it?
still don't believe you.
When was this? Like years ago or like recent?
Like a month ago. Oh, a little bit less.
Yeah.
Why did you watch?
Stream that.
He doesn't want one.
Oh,
Okay.
So just for the record, I'm not like a total jerk. We ended up trading. I gave him my Beats. I gave him my Beats and he gave me the watch.
That's a fair trade.
Huh?
I'll allow it.
You think he won? Oh, I definitely won.
Oh, yeah. Is it a new one or is it like one of the older ones?
No, it's brand new. Yeah.
Was it headphones or earbuds? That's hard.
So does he look like super cool, like when he's like in the zone, or like
He's like-
Is they wireless?
He's got the solos.
I don't know.
Studio
Are they
solos, wireless.
He doesn't look as cool now because he has glasses now. No, I'm just messing around.
I had to get lazy, man. I can't do that. I absolutely weird.
I don't know, he looks fun. He looks long, he's long hair. His hair is like pretty long.
Wow. Yours was pretty long. I think he's sending shots.
Oh my god, yo, yeah, no, my hair was long. I still can't believe that.
I guess I couldn't resist one random thing while we were doing this. It's just thinking about like early adopters versus late adopters is important. When thinking about who's going to be susceptible to coercion, who's more likely to imitate, you know. So when you're predicting what states might do what, that's why it's important. Electoral pressures, we always have to think about in terms of policy adoption. Whether it's, you know, adopting, enacting purely symbolic policies to be seen to do something, whether it's stopping policies before an election because you want the people to have their say, even though they would have their say no matter what. The stage of the policy process can have an impact. And then certain characteristics of the policies are going to make it easier or harder for things to get transferred, right? So how complex it is going to be a big part of it. How compatible it is with local culture, with local infrastructure, local technology, geography. All of those types of things can have a big impact. How observable it is. Right, so like how easy is it for other places to see, hey, check this out, it's working. This notion of relative advantage, remember that? I can play into it. We start talking about actually specializing and trading and all of that. Trialability, this just means the ability to actually test things out and to get a decent evaluation out of it so that we know whether or not it works. And generally speaking, whether or not it works soon. Because of our, you know, short run emphasis and that kind of thing. Any questions on those? One thing I do want to talk about is, you know, there's this constant tension in the United States between having governments as local as possible create policy, like school boards, versus having a uniform policy nationwide. You know, and so we want to think a little bit about what some of the advantages and disadvantages of, say, centralization are. One thing that we can do is we can use economies of scale to make things more efficient. Uniformity does have its advantages. It makes things a little bit easier. If you just think about driver's licenses, hunting licenses, fishing licenses, of course, marriage licenses, any kind of license, basically. How about the license, like to practice medicine?
Oh, that's by state.
I know it is, a lot. Wouldn't it be better if it was just a national standard and then it should be?
Or law.
Or law,
Yeah.
or cosmetology. It does put some limits on that bad competition I was talking about, the race to the bottom stuff. You know, if we have sort of uniform standards on what people can do in terms of tax incentives, the ability to address externalities is a big one, right? So that if states are doing something that's going to be harmful to neighboring states, then having some kind of uniform policy could be good. Now this would be, you know, for people who are opposed to legalization of marijuana, right? They point to this existence of a federal law and says, no, it has to be this way all over the country. It would have made things easier. It would have made the process a little bit smoother had that law not been in place in terms of banking regulations and that kind of stuff. But anyway, any kind of redistributive policy I think falls under, it would be better to be handled at the national level. It avoids this whole notion of voting with your feet, of people moving, of trying to be, like avoid being welfare magnets. What's been interesting is some states have been like, bring it. Like, I'm happy to be a welfare magnet. And you see this especially with attracting undocumented populations. So there's natural reasons why California and Texas would have large undocumented populations, but they're even larger because California and Texas actually provide benefits for undocumented people that no other state does, right? Like in-state tuition. You can get financial aid for college, you can get driver's license, you can get healthcare, you can get all kinds of stuff. So, at times you'll see people using that to their advantage, or what they perceive as their advantage. Some disadvantages: competition isn't necessarily a bad thing. It really just depends on the context and what it is that you're trying to do. It would reduce our ability to experiment if everything was on a national level. It's much easier for us in the US to have policy experiments than it is in places like France. So it is an advantage that we have. This is a big one, that really is important to a lot of people, this decreased ability to adapt to local environments. We have such a huge country, and it seems silly to have the exact same policies in southern Florida that you have in the Upper Peninsula. So to a certain degree it makes sense to do that. And then you think about education, and this is where it can get sort of interesting, especially with Florida continuing to go off the deep end. But this idea of some kind of federal standards for education, might be useful. But on the other hand, local communities want to be able to educate local children in the values, that they sort of hold there. There's a really interesting Supreme Court case that y'all should be looking out for, having to do with sort of a coach wanting to be able to do prayers pre-game and that kind of stuff. But it looks like it might open the door to some aspect of religion in public schools that has been closed since the 60s.
Most coaches don't even ask.
No.
Like, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Well,
I didn't get
how many of y'all had prayers in your school?
in school or like in sports?
Yeah.
Sports, I had
Either
sports
one.
prayers.
School sports.
School sport, yeah, like all the
Yeah.
time.
Coach
Sometimes
led.
no.
Yeah.
Coach led.
Just like a short thing.
I mean, look, as you know all too well, I used to teach in Alabama. There was a whole lot of religion in Alabama public schools. And, the bottom line is if nobody complains, you can do it. It may not be constitutional, but if nobody files a lawsuit.
So someone filed a lawsuit against this coach, is that how this came?
Yeah,
Wasn't there something like this in like Texas? I feel like.
There's been a lot of them.
Court case where, but it was like a student-led prayer before the game. They did over the speaker
That's right.
system,
Student-led prayer,
and then it got shut down.
it did. So, yeah, technically, you really should be having no prayer whatsoever in school. You can have a moment of silence.
I was gonna say, it's kind of interesting to think about like prayers in schools, like how you said, if no one complains, but then also think about like which religions are more normalized for that to be the case.
Right.
Because if we're really being honest, in
Because-
American schools, if you had tried to do like a Muslim prayer. then
Right.
someone would-
Just think about that, right? Like, somebody would definitely complain about that. It's only if it's some form of Christian prayer that You know, the expectation is that people won't complain.
Can you repeat the point that you made about ability to address externalities for advantages?
Yeah, so, you know, if you think about the marijuana legalization, right, in Colorado, well, there were lots of externalities associated with that for people in Oklahoma. And there's actually all kinds of like legal battles between the two states about who was responsible for like law enforcement in Oklahoma as a result of Colorado legalizing weed. Right? If you have a federal standard on that, then those externalities will exist. All right, so just sort of putting all together, there aren't any really clear answers as to which of these policies is correct, as I said. I think that they all have value, and that's why I sort of go through them all. And whenever you're thinking about the ability to transfer one policy, like a policy from one jurisdiction to another, I think they're all worth thinking through. You know, we have to just sort of recognize that there are going to be these exogenous factors that are going to play a huge role. It could be something like a new composition of the Supreme Court that suddenly leads to a whole new round of anti-abortion laws, right? That's an exogenous factor. One of the things that is unfortunate about the literature is that it does focus on adoption and not implementation. And as we know, policies can change a lot in the implementation process. That's one of the reasons why earlier I had sort of the stage of the policy process as an important aspect, that adoption alone doesn't guarantee that a policy is going to look the same. And then just context matters. It's a good just overall lesson in public policy, right? Context matters.
Should have been on the first day.
Any questions? So diffusion is one of those things when I just sit here and talk about it, it seems really, really boring. And I get that. But when you sit and you actually think about how policies pass from one area to another and why they fail to go to some places, it can actually be kind of interesting. It's hard to do that while presenting enough information to allow you to think about it. So I apologize for that, but it is something that's interesting. I have to figure out how I'm going to test on it for the final exam, because I didn't start doing the policy diffusion until a couple of years ago, which is when I started doing essays. And we're not doing an essay for the final exam, so we'll see. I'm going to come up with something. Don't worry about that. All right. Any questions about the exam or any of that stuff, Michelle?
Is the final exam cumulative?
No.
Okay, so it's only like the second half after the midterm?
Yep.
It's a way, but.
I'm pretty sure it says that on the syllabus.
I'm very stressed right now, so I'm not.
Should we give Jeff a round of applause for this semester?
Huge. Maybe till I've heard him talk more than enough semester. One thing I do need people to do, especially since it's such a small class, is do your evaluations. If you haven't done it, you have until the end of tomorrow, I believe, to get it done. And that's for all classes. I really encourage you to do it for all your classes, even if it's just kind of a class. What normally happens is people who either really like the class or really hate the class fill out the evaluations. And that is so unhelpful to us as teachers.
Well, what I noticed in the STEM requirements is that they never incorporate changes.
They never incorporate the changes anyway.
Yeah.
Well, I do, I listen to those things when when they make sense. Well, in this world of alternative facts, you get people who just put something that's just like blatantly untrue.
I killed my cat.
Right, like he doesn't post his PowerPoints. I believe I'm one of the few professors that actually does. But I literally got that like a year or two ago. It's just like. I mean, there's no other reactions you can have,
Right.
right?
If you have a folder, just fill with PowerPoint.
Right, I mean, then. No, it was amusing, but, any other questions, or
It's not open up, right?
it's not open though? No, this is a regular test.
Hard deadline for the paper tonight.
No. So paper, I would like to have as many of them in as I can, I mean, just to spread out the grading load. But here's the thing, I've already read most of your papers twice. Okay, yeah, Cameron, you should be scratching your head. So those papers don't take me as long to grade. Right, which is always a good thing when it comes to the nature of that grade. The hard deadline for the papers is
I'm getting it better.
So I was gonna ask you for an extension. anyway.
I have to turn grades in on the 6th.
Oh.
Okay. So that's why that's the hard deadline. But that being said, you should all follow like Charlotte's lead. She's already turned hers in.
Mine is ready, mine is ready, I'm about to be printed, I just
Okay.
wanted to talk about it. You before I turn it in.
Mine's ready, I just need to edit it by someone else.
But yeah, and then I will make sure to have problem sets graded before the exam, so that y'all have that.
And this is like a group exam, we're all taking one.
Yeah.
It's like a Kahoot.
Is it like a team where I can partner up with?
I'm gonna make. I don't know.
Oh, did we used to do that?
I don't know how I'm gonna make that spread out here.
I
There's no real way.
Well, you can reorganize the tables into like,
Good, then I have to move tables.
That is true.
Is there another exam at 8 a.m. too?
No, it's at
I
noon.
think I do.
Wait, it's not a third,
Not to you, it's-
That's hard.
Dude, yeah, that's my reality, but I backpack.
Yeah.
All my
I got
exams
2
are
except
literally
like-
Oh, that's already open.
So,
How many
I
hours?
actually don't like 8 a.m. exams myself. I mean, they're done. Because you have nothing to do ahead of, like, you don't have to waste time.
I'm trying to decide how many
Get up,
hours
you go, you take the exam.
while I'm taking 2 summer courses.
And I'm not a morning person at all.
How many hours do you think?
Yeah,
Still
I'm taking 2 summer courses.
What course did you go?
It's insane. You come 400.
How many hours should I
I'll email you.
Yeah.
I did two together.
So like 3 days a week?
You can do anything else.
In a weekend.
Right, I got that.
Yeah.
Well, it
So
doesn't make
then,
sense
like,
for you to do
depending on
this.
the size, you're gonna have like
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a rough schedule.
You had it on our website.
You should just do
I
Yeah.
didn't file it all
But I
up.
would-
Yeah, dude, this is
Like,
several.
yeah.
Just do weekends, lose your weekends and.
Maybe I'll check that.
My.
Like,
We're done.
that's what I-
My job, my job.
Oh.
we have one.
No.
Yeah, so my big plan. My class is at like
No.
10, I go like 10
No,
to
you
1.
just indicate,
Go to class, go play 18 holes an hour, and then go to work.
Dude, you're not gonna do this, not easy.
Can you wanna do your spot?
I don't see issues with you got.
Oh, wait, no, for the reason.
Yeah. I've been taking it.
Well, I'm taking it.
I'm taking it next semester.
Oh, God, you're taking the minutes?
No, I'm doing, it's like summer session.
Okay. I'm taking an intro to archaeology.
I'm taking this. You're kind of world book already.
I'm just.
I'm getting like 8 people.
Yeah.
So wait, you don't. It's not that. What did you find is the highest grade?
I was like, oh yeah, my AP stats exam's gonna be asked. I got a five there.
I was like,
I'm so sad. I was like, I got 40 shot. Yeah, I do. Like maybe. Yeah. Oh, dude, I was gonna take a Yes, literally. Yeah.
No, I'm gonna ask you two a question. I know you were writing the paper. What did you do? No, it's not. It says like, for the second.
Do exactly what you said.
Okay.
He and I literally just talked about this.
Yep. Okay, yeah, because this is the problem, like, I school, it's the only spot I can start.
I was mid-writing it and then I realized that I had too much information in it and so I did.
Thank you.
That's included.
Yep, see ya.
Same.
Yeah.
I had that when I cut like,
Yeah.
my entire day, my
I
second.
have 2 pages of sources.
For my entire like
Pages of
second.
Sources,
Yeah.
I have 3
I think I have
singular
4.
sources.
Really?
All of them say the same stuff.
No, all of them say the same stuff, but then I started like parsing like details from like specific sources and
Yeah.
it just got like very, very long.
I think I have like 16 sources.
16?
Like that is
Yeah.
so long.
No, no.
What's wrong with you?
It's
I
just
have
like one
15,
paragraph.
I
I was
think.
like, this is
3,
I have
6,
a lot of
9,
sentences.
It's fun.
Okay.
12, 15.
I had
Yeah.
14 pages, then I cut like my entire like second draft part out because I like I did it wrong. I was like, I've been rewriting it. Speaking of which,
So I am probably gonna throw this in because I'm tired of this movie
But
over
we,
my head.
like,
No, I read
we
it.
don't get
twice
penalized
last night, I
for
pissed.
submitting after.
No, I got my friend to read it. I'm like,
I was like, I was super worried. I was like, soft deadline.
Yeah.
How much? Use 10 points? No.
No, you're not gonna.
I'm
Last
tired.
night,
It's not
yeah.
gonna-
I'm gonna pop like 2 bangs and start working.
Please.
It's 10 actual
That's
pages.
everything else.
Dude, my
Yeah.
dorm
No,
room,
I
I
was
have a
like,
banged
everything
wall.
else after
This-
Oh my god.
Cause first
I
semester,
hate
I
that.
like,
I
I only
hate
got a
that.
history like 300 course.
Can't recover
So I
that.
had,
No,
I
you
did
really
early
can't.
college and I
I've never relied on any tricks to do any assignments, ever.
I had to write a 10, I had a 12-page
And then I
paper
would
due
grab my
in
cat
6
somewhere
hours.
in
So
her
I
area and then
popped
walk
in
down
2
the
bangs.
stairs.
It was like,
Like in the
Turned it out.
soaking wet.
Yeah.
it's like, I don't know, it's not so
Yeah.
scary.
She's
Yeah, you don't
on
wanna-
my stomach.
Hi, just wanted to say thank you for a good semester.
Oh, you're
Yes.
very welcome.
Yes, it's been a great
Pleasure.
semester.
Yeah.
That's
And my
fun.
laptop and everything.
Okay,
Yeah,
so what's the status?
so
Why are you doing here?
right now I'm using my mom's laptop. She has 2.
Okay.
So she said that because I have finals,
Yeah.
I kind of can't, like over the weekends, Davis isn't open all the time, so it's not like I can
Right.
be there all the time reviewing my notes. Yeah. It's okay, I worked my lesson, next time either get apple can or
What
don't
this?
Yes.
get
Oh,
a
God.
coffee.
I need
She's
this.
supposed to read all of
Is
it.
it that bad?
Yeah.
It's not like